Hello everyone, my name is Elizabeth Taber, and today I will be discussing two different court cases and how to critique one's finding using a de-logical approach or a teleological approach. Next, I will present the reason why it is easier to comply with diversity legislation in Canada than it is in the United States. Finally, I will examine some video games and then evaluate the different cultural messages that can be found. In a case of university and community college system versus farmer, of $40,000 were paid to farmer because of the Equal Pay Act. To understand this case, it is important to understand the background. Basically, farmer wanted to get a job working at a university in Nevada. The position was not given to Farmer but to an African American applicant. 1 year later, Farmer was offered a position at the university which paid $7,000 less than the amount of money that was given to the previous person who applied for the job. Farmer was enraged, so she sued the university on the basis of the Equal Pay Act. Later, the university won the appeal in front of the state of Nevada's Supreme Court. The Supreme Court, however, declined to hear the case, leaving the lower court's decision or verdict in place. This case can be examined using a teleological approach or a de-logical approach. According to Allard, a teleological approach is an ethical argument based on moral obligations or duty. In this case, one could argue that the university gave more money to the African American applicant out of a sense of duty. The university argued that since only 1% of its facility members were a minority group, it followed a minority bonus program whereby a department could hire an additional facility member if it first hired a minority facility member. It could be argued that this bonus was given to the African American man because this minority group makes a small percentage of the staff. Also, since the university follows the minority bonus program, the school must follow the guidelines that come with the program. In a sense, the African American was hired because of the minority program. Also, when this applicant was hired, then the school could consider other candidates as well. Next, this business transaction could be based on a teleological approach. According to Allard, a teleological approach is a decision based on the good that comes from the action. It is the idea that the end justifies the action or the means. This approach is often used in the workplace as a good business strategy. The university could argue that it made the right decision because research has shown that people with different backgrounds can make a company stronger and more successful. Therefore, the African American was hired because he can benefit the company. This university could argue their case using a teleological approach or a de-logical approach to prove the school made the right decision in hiring this applicant. The next court case involves a company called Watchmark Committal Corporation. 60 people lost their jobs in this company when their jobs were given to people in India. Some of those who were losing their jobs still had to stay and train their replacements, or else they would not receive their service pay and unemployment benefits. In light of this information, one can examine this situation through a teleological approach or a de-logical perspective. This decision is based on a teleological perspective when the good of the company comes first. Many different companies across the United States employ this kind of strategy when making decisions. This strategy is based on the idea of the greatest good for the greatest number. A business example is found in a cost-benefit analysis through which the benefits are weighed against the costs. A decision is made based on the path that will provide the greatest overall gain for the least cost. This business deal follows this principle. This decision is non-ethical because it is about the greatest good for the greatest number rather than a moral code or standard. From the teleological perspective, this is a good decision since the company will benefit or profit. On the other hand, from a teleological perspective, this is a bad decision because a teleological perspective follows a moral obligation or standard. A teleological perspective can be summarized by the golden rule, which is do to others as you would like them to do to you. This decision clearly violates the standard because no one wants to lose their job. In this case, the decision is either right or wrong, depending on one's definition of what is good or what is valuable. So far, we have briefly examined some court cases and how people can make decisions using a teleological approach or a teleological approach. Now I will discuss why it is easier to comply with diversity standards in Canada rather than in the United States. First, in order to understand why it is easier to comply with diversity standards in Canada rather than the United States, it is important to understand how the two countries are different from each other. First, Canadians believe in their government, whereas Americans tend to view their government with suspicion. This attitude towards government has its history in America's rebellion against Great Britain. The revolutionaries expected that Canada would join them in fighting the English king. However, Canada remained loyal and received its independence in 1867. Another key difference between the two countries is that the Canadian government has less power than the U.S. government. This is especially true when it comes to employment regulation. In everyday practice, this means that on employment issues, laws of Canadian federal government affect only those industries that are federally regulated according to Canadian Constitution. These industries include banking, railroads, broadcasting, shipping, and so on. So the Canadian government only has control over 10% of Canadian employees, while the other 90% are regulated by provincial laws. This would seem to suggest that employers have more freedom in Canada because they must obey laws that only affect their province. In the United States, employers must obey the federal government legislation that is not province by province, but rather universally applies to all companies with no exceptions. So, for example, in Canada, Sears, stores that can be found across the country, is not federally regulated but retailing is not federally regulated under Canadian Constitution. This means that Canada must obey the laws of each province to which it operates. Now that we understand some of the background information, it is easier to understand why it is easier for Canada to comply with diversity legislation than in the United States. But we also need to understand that even in Canada, there are diversity legislation that applies to everyone, such as the Canadian Human Rights Act, which forbids discrimination by federally regulated employers based on race and gender. So the main reason why it is easier to comply with diversity legislation in Canada compared to the United States is because employers are only required to obey employment diversity legislation province by province, which means that employers have fewer rules to follow and each law is specific to that region. Diversity standards do not only apply to different countries but also found in video games. Video games often convey messages to their audience. A common message found in video games is that violence is an acceptable behavior. Also, video games can send messages about gender roles. In one video game, the female character was portrayed as equal in physical strength and abilities to the male player because the female player could also do the same activities, which include destroying objects and killing the villains. The stereotype that women are weaker than men was not evident. In another game, the cultural message seemed to be that it is acceptable to steal and destroy objects. In one particular game, a character was using a gun to destroy a car. These video games seem to have this common component in each: violence. Also, the roles of the villain and the hero seemed to be switched as the hero was participating in activities that seemed to be anti-hero. Also, the main characters or heroes had different costumes. One character looked ghost-like, and another character was wearing a skeleton costume. In a sense, there was a blur from the traditional idea of goodness as found in following a moral code of ethics, and replaced with the idea that the hero does not do good acts, but rather combats those opposing him or them. In this discussion, we have looked at teleological and deological approaches when it comes to court cases. Second, we have examined why it is easier to comply with diversity legislation in Canada rather than the United States. Finally, we have looked at different video games and cultural message that video games convey to the audience. Thank you for watching.